She had been dead for 11 minutes. The monitors confirmed it. The attending physician had signed off. The time of death was entered into the chart at 3:09 a.m., and the ward had settled back into the particular silence that follows a death on the night shift. That held breath quiet, that experienced nurses learn to recognize and never quite get used to. So nobody could explain why, when the night nurse returned to the room 20 minutes later to begin preparing the body, the woman's hand was warm. Not the residual warmth of recent death. Warm. The way a living hand is warm. And it was raised. Fingers extended, palm out, pointing at the closed door as if directing someone to leave, or warning someone not to enter. These are the stories they don't put in the hospital brochures. These are the accounts that get passed between nurses at the end of long shifts, spoken quietly in break rooms and parking lots, and over cold coffee at 4 in the morning. Stories from the people who chose medicine because they believe in evidence, in data, in what can be observed and measured and explained. People who are still, years later, unable to explain what they saw. After midnight, a hospital becomes a different place entirely. The visitors leave, the administrators go home, the corridors empty, and the overhead lights dim to their nighttime setting. And what remains is the soft percussion of IV pumps and ventilators, and the low, ceaseless hum of a building that is never fully asleep, because dying does not observe business hours. These are 10 of the most disturbing true accounts ever shared by medical workers. Every one of them is real. Every one of these people went back to work the next night. That is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. Story 1. The elevator at 3 a.m. Her name was Renee, and she had been a night shift nurse for 6 years before she started paying close attention to the elevator. The hospital was old, constructed in the early 1950s, renovated twice in the decades since, but never fully updated, never fully stripped of whatever the original walls had absorbed over 70 years of human suffering and human dying. The building had a particular quality that older hospitals share, a weight to the air, a density that newer facilities don't have. As if the accumulated presence of everyone who had ever passed through its doors left something behind that could not be cleaned away or painted over or replaced with modern fixtures. Renee worked on the 7th floor. The unit had lived several lives before she arrived. In the 1960s, it had been a pediatric ward, full of children who were cared for in that era's particular way, which is to say, with competence and very little tenderness, visiting hours restricted, parents discouraged from staying overnight. In the 1980s, the pediatric ward closed and the floor was converted to an AIDS hospice, and for nearly 15 years, it held the dying of an epidemic that the rest of the city preferred not to look at directly. By the time Renee arrived, it was post-acute long-term care, and the senior nurses told the floor's history to every new staff member as a matter of course, not to frighten anyone. They were past frightening by then, just to explain certain things. The elevator came up on its own. That was the thing that needed explaining. Night after night, Renee or one of her colleagues would be sitting at the nurses' station, and they would hear the mechanical engagement of the cable system deep in the shaft, hear the slow ascent of the car, and they would look up and watch the floor indicator above the doors count upward in the dim corridor light. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The doors would open. The car would be empty. No one inside. No one visible in the corridor below when they checked. This was not a building with electrical problems. The elevator had been professionally serviced twice in the 12 months prior. There was no logical mechanism by which an empty car could travel to the 7th floor without being called from that floor, without a button being pressed on 7, without a reason. But it came. Almost every night. Almost always between 2 and 4 in the morning. The senior nurses had developed a ritual around it. The kind of ritual that forms in workplaces when an unexplained thing happens, often enough that people need a way to process it and move on. When the elevator arrived empty and the doors opened into the quiet corridor, whoever was closest would stand from their chair and walk to the open doors and say, without embarrassment, without self-consciousness, without the slightest tone of mockery, "Hi, Georgie," and the doors would close. And the elevator would descend, and it would not return that night. Georgie was the name they had given the presence, settled on after a vote early in Renee's first year, the logic being that naming something makes it less frightening. She was skeptical of that logic. She was skeptical of all of it. For the first 3 months she worked that floor, Renee ran down every rational explanation she could construct. Faulty motion sensors in the car triggering a ghost call. Someone on a lower floor repeatedly pressing the wrong button in a pattern that consistently sent the car to 7. A glitch in the building automation system. Some looped instruction in the elevator controller that nobody had bothered to trace. She called the facilities manager twice. He inspected the system both times and told her nothing was wrong. She reviewed the call logs the elevator kept on its own internal system. Every floor request was logged. On the nights when the car came to 7 on its own, the log showed no request from any floor. The car had simply moved, of its own will, in the middle of the night, to the floor that had once held dying children and then dying men that the city had abandoned. 6 months into her tenure on the 7th floor, Renee was alone at the station at 2:47 in the morning. Her colleagues were on break or in patient rooms. The corridor was empty. She heard the cable engage. She watched the indicator climb. She did not get up. She sat and watched the doors open and looked at the empty car for a long time. Long enough that the elevator's automatic close timer should have triggered. But the doors stayed open, as if waiting. As if something in that car was waiting for an acknowledgement before it would leave. She stood up slowly. She walked to the elevator. She stood at the threshold and looked into the empty car, and she said it for the first time. "Hi, Georgie." The doors closed. The elevator went down. She stood in the corridor for a while after that, and breathed, and then went back to the station and sat down. She never looked for the explanation again after that night. She decided that some things are real, whether or not they can be explained, and that the work goes on regardless. The memory care unit where CNA Maria worked for 8 years had 12 beds, and of those 12, bed 11 was the one the staff avoided. Not officially. There was no policy, no notation in the facility guidelines. No administrative acknowledgement that the room at the far end of the east corridor was in any way different from the others. Officially, it was simply a bed, a private room, slightly larger than the standard layout, situated at an odd corner where 2 wings of the building met at an angle that the original architect had apparently not fully resolved. Unofficially, among the night staff, among the people who actually worked the floor, after the families went home and the facility director left for the evening, the understanding was clear. You kept that room empty if you could. You put someone in 11 only when you had absolutely no other choice. The smell was ordinary. The light was ordinary. The furniture was identical to every other room on the unit. There was nothing visible, nothing that could be pointed to and documented. What made room 11 different was what happened to the people inside it. Patients who were transferred to bed 11, even patients who were stable, who were lucid, who had no acute medical deterioration, no new diagnosis, no clinical reason to change, would change. Within days of arriving in that room, sometimes within hours, they would stop sleeping. Not the ordinary sleep disruption that is common in memory care, not the sundowning that most of the residents experienced to some degree. A different quality of wakefulness, tense, alert, as if they were listening. They would look at the corner, the upper corner of the room, where the east wall and the interior wall met the ceiling at that unresolved angle. They would look at it, and they would speak to it. Not in the way dementia patients sometimes speak to hallucinations of family members, which is well documented and clinically understood. This was different. It had the quality of a response, as if something were being said to them first, and they were answering. Quietly, urgently, in voices too low to make out from the doorway. Maria began keeping informal notes after the third patient in that room displayed the behavior. By the time she had 6 sets of notes, the pattern was undeniable. Every patient. Every time. The corner. The whispered conversation with something nobody else could perceive. She asked one of them directly. Her name was Frances, a former school teacher, 81 years old, moderate dementia, but remarkable verbal clarity. The kind of patient you could still have a real conversation with on most days. Frances had been in room 11 for 3 nights when Maria found her sitting upright in the dark at 2 in the morning, looking at the corner and murmuring. Maria turned on the low nightlight and asked her who she was talking to. Frances turned and looked at her with an expression of mild surprise, the way you look at someone who has asked an obvious question. She said, "The children, dear. I'm telling them it's too late to be out." Maria asked what children. Frances turned back to the corner and said, without hesitation and without any particular distress, "The ones who can't find the way out. They've been trying for a long time." Maria stood in that doorway for longer than she should have. Then she asked Frances if the children frightened her. Frances considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. She said no. She said they were just lost. She said she had been a teacher for 40 years, and lost children were something she understood. She was trying to help them find the door. Maria nodded and dimmed the nightlight, and left the room, and stood in the corridor, and did not write any of that in the official log. Room 11 was kept empty after that, whenever the census allowed. On the nights when the unit was full, and a new admission had no choice but to go to bed 11, Maria or whoever was on shift would check that room more frequently than any other, every 40 minutes through the night, sometimes more. They told themselves it was standard precaution, elevated monitoring for a new placement. None of them said out loud what they were actually watching for. None of them needed to. On the last night before Maria left that facility for a different job, she stood in the doorway of the empty room 11 and looked at the corner for a long time. She doesn't know what she was expecting. Nothing looked back. But she had the distinct and specific sensation, standing there in the threshold, that the room was not empty, that it was simply waiting, patiently, the way a room that has held many people over many years learns to wait for whoever would come next. Night shift in the emergency department is a different world from day shift, and experienced ER nurses will tell you this, not as a complaint, but as a fact of physiology and human behavior. The drunk drivers come in after midnight. The overdoses peak between 2 and 4. The domestic calls arrive after the bars close. And then, around the time the city has finally exhausted itself, around 4 or 5 in the morning, there is a lull that the staff sometimes call the dead hours, not because of what they see, but because of the particular quality of the silence. The ER nurse who submitted this account has been working nights for 14 years. She asked that her name not be used. She said this is the only incident in 14 years that she has never been able to find a rational frame for. The woman came in at 3:40 a.m. on a Tuesday in November. She was 63 years old, conscious and communicative, brought in by ambulance after a neighbor called 911 when the woman had not answered her door for 2 days. Her vitals on arrival were poor, blood pressure critically low, heart rate irregular, skin color indicating she had been in distress for some time. The attending physician assessed her quickly, and the team moved her to a trauma bay. She was alert enough to give her name and her date of birth. She was alert enough to say, clearly and without confusion, that she was not afraid. The nurse noted this in particular because patients in that condition are almost always afraid. They stabilized her enough to transfer her to a bay for further assessment. The nurse was with her, running a line, when the woman grabbed her wrist. Not in distress. Firmly. Deliberately. She looked at the nurse and said, "There's a man standing at the foot of my bed." The nurse looked. There was no one at the foot of the bed. The bay was otherwise empty. The nurse told her gently that there was no one there, that she was safe, that the team was with her. The woman shook her head. She said, "He's been with me for 2 days." She said it calmly. She said he was tall, and he hadn't spoken, but he had been standing in her apartment for 2 days before she lost consciousness, and he had followed her here in the ambulance, and he was standing at the foot of the bed right now. She described him in detail. Dark coat. No expression. Simply present. Simply waiting. The nurse finished the line. She called for the attending. They ran their assessments. Over the next 40 minutes, the woman's condition continued to deteriorate despite intervention. At 4:52 a.m., her heart stopped. They worked for 17 minutes. They could not bring her back. The attending called it at 5:09 a.m., and the team stepped back from the table, and the bay became the particular kind of quiet that follows a failed resuscitation. Not peaceful, not resolved. Simply finished. The nurse was charting at the station outside the bay when the unit clerk, who had not been present during the resuscitation and had not heard the woman's account, came up beside her and said, quietly and without any preamble, "Did you feel that?" The nurse asked what she meant. The unit clerk said she wasn't sure. She said it felt like the air in the department had changed, like something had been in the building and had left. She said it had happened right around 5 in the morning, and she couldn't explain it. And she knew it sounded strange, but she wanted to say it out loud before she talked herself out of it. The nurse looked at her for a moment. Then she looked back at the bay, where the woman's body was still lying, covered under a sheet. She said, "I know what you mean." And she went back to her charting. She has thought about that woman a great deal in the years since, about the 2 days she spent in her apartment with something she could see, and no one else could, about the fact that she was not frightened, about the calm in her voice when she described the figure at the foot of the bed, not the calm of confusion or of a mind that had detached from reality, but the calm of someone who has had sufficient time to arrive at acceptance. The nurse has no framework for what the woman saw. She has only the memory of that grip on her wrist, firm and certain, and the woman's voice saying, "He's been with me for 2 days." As if that were simply a piece of information, as if it were important that someone know. He arrived on the cardiac ICU at the VA hospital on a Thursday evening in late autumn, transferred from the general medical floor where his heart condition had first presented. He was 74 years old. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam and come home in 1971 and spent the next 50 years without a diagnosis that adequately explained what had happened to him over those decades. The hypervigilance, the inability to sleep in darkness, the compulsion that the night nurses would come to know well over the course of his admissions. His chart listed his primary diagnosis as heart failure. The secondary diagnosis, finally given a name late in his life by a VA psychiatrist who recognized what she was looking at, was severe PTSD. The nurse who cared for him most consistently has asked that he be referred to only as the veteran. She wants his dignity protected. He deserves that much. He did not sleep on the unit at night. Not on his first admission, not on any of the 3 that followed. Once the floor quieted, once the last family member had gone, and the overhead lights had dimmed to their nighttime setting, he would rise from his bed and he would begin to walk. The nurses discovered on the first night that interfering with this was a mistake. He became agitated in a way that was distressing to him and to the other patients, a raw animal alertness that had nothing to do with confusion and everything to do with an old, deep training that his body had never been permitted to unlearn. So they let him walk. They watched him on the monitors from the station, and they let him do what he needed to do. What he needed to do was check every room. He moved methodically, the same sequence every night, never varying. He would stop at the doorway of each patient room and stand for a moment, looking inside, before moving on. He never entered a room. He never woke anyone. He was quiet as a person could be, moving through the unit in his hospital gown and non-slip socks, his face carrying an expression that one nurse described as the most focused she had ever seen on a human being. Not the focus of effort or concentration, but the focus of absolute, practiced attention. The attention of someone who has learned, in the most irreversible way possible, what the cost of inattention is. When the nurses asked him what he was doing, his answer was always the same. Keeping watch over the others, he would say, making sure everyone gets home. He would then nod at whoever had spoken to him and continue his circuit. The nurses stopped asking after the second night. The other patients on the unit, many of them also veterans, many of them also old and broken, in ways that the particular violence of war manufactures and time cannot repair, seemed to sleep better on the nights he walked. The nurse noted this in her personal journal, though not in his chart. The call light frequency dropped on his nights. The agitation events among the other patients decreased. Whatever he was doing, however it should be classified, it appeared to be working. He died on his 4th admission. His heart gave out at 4 a.m. on a February night, quietly between his rounds. He had completed his circuit of the unit. The nurses reviewing the hall cameras later could confirm that he had checked every room before he returned to his bed for the last time. His primary nurse found him at 4:17 a.m. The resuscitation team was called, but there was nothing to be done. The attending called it at 4:38. The unit settled into that particular post-death silence. When the nurse made her morning rounds at 6 o'clock, checking on each of the remaining patients before the day shift arrived, every patient on the unit reported the same thing independently. They had slept well. Deeply, they said. Better than they had slept in months. One man, a Korean War veteran in his 80s, with advanced heart disease and a documented history of severe nighttime agitation, told the nurse he had the best sleep of his life. He said he didn't know why. He said he just felt safe. She stood in the corridor after finishing her rounds and thought about the veteran and about the 50 years he had spent not sleeping and about the last 4 admissions he had spent making sure everyone on that unit got home, and she allowed herself to cry, briefly, before the day shift arrived and there was no more time for it. She has 15 years of experience in surgical nursing, and she submitted this account to an online forum for healthcare workers and then deleted it 48 hours later, apparently having decided that the professional risk of having her name attached to such a story outweighed the relief of having told it. Someone had already saved it. What follows is as close to her original words as reconstruction allows. The incident occurred on a Tuesday night in early spring, in a hospital surgical suite that she describes as modern, well-lit, and thoroughly ordinary, the kind of environment that she had always found actively reassuring in its clinical sterility, its commitment to the measurable and the procedural. It's absolute indifference to anything that could not be documented in a chart. She was working with a single partner that night, short-staffed, as night shifts in surgical units routinely are. Her partner was in the scrub room. She had stepped out of the main OR suite to retrieve a specific piece of equipment from the supply corridor, a brief errand that took perhaps 4 minutes. On her way back, she passed the glass panel set into the wall beside the OR suite door, a narrow window, perhaps 18 inches wide, positioned at roughly chest height, used by staff to check conditions in the room before entering without breaking sterile protocol. She glanced through it automatically, the way you do when you pass a window, and she stopped walking. There was someone sitting at the nurse's station inside the OR suite. The suite was locked. She had the only key apart from her partner, who was in the scrub room 20 feet in the other direction. But there was someone in the chair at the station, their back to the glass panel, their legs crossed at the knee, one foot moving in a slow, regular arc. The posture was completely relaxed, the kind of posture that speaks of someone comfortable, settled, with no particular urgency. She stood at the glass for several seconds, trying to process what she was seeing. She knocked on the panel. The figure did not turn. She went to the intercom mounted beside the door and called into the room. The figure shifted, a slight movement of the upper body toward the sound, the way you move when you hear something at the edge of your awareness, but did not turn fully, and did not respond, and continued the slow pendulum movement of the foot. She went to the scrub room and got her partner. She said nothing except, "Come with me, look at this." Her partner came. They both stood at the glass panel. Her partner said nothing for a moment and then said, "Yeah, I see it." They unlocked the door together and entered the suite. The room was empty. The chair at the nurse's station was positioned exactly as it had appeared through the glass. No one was in it. No one was anywhere in the suite. There was no secondary exit from the OR suite that did not pass through either the main door or the scrub room, both of which had been observed continuously from the moment she first saw the figure. They stood in the empty room together for a moment. Her partner said she had noticed the figure through the glass a few minutes before the nurse had come to get her. She had assumed it was a reflection, some trick of the corridor lighting, and had decided not to mention it. They looked at each other. Then they went back to work. They did not discuss it with their supervisor. They did not file a report. There was nothing to report, no intruder, no evidence of anything. Just two experienced nurses who had both seen a person sitting in a locked room and then found the room empty. What would the report say? She deleted the forum post. She wrote in a follow-up comment before that too disappeared, because she realized after posting it that she didn't want it attached to her professional identity. But she wanted it documented somewhere. She wanted someone to know. She said she has worked in that suite dozens of times since the incident, and nothing similar has occurred. She said she still glances through the glass panel every time she passes it on the way back from supply. She said she doesn't know what she's looking for. She said she's not sure she wants to find it again. But she looks. Every time. Because some things, once seen, change the way you look at the familiar. And there is no going back to the time before you saw them.